Hi, I'm Steve Rigdon from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at St. Louis University. I'm one of the authors of the book Monitoring the Health of Populations by Tracking Disease Outbreaks, and I'm going to talk briefly about the careful design of experiments that led Walter Reed and the Yellow Fever Board to discover the cause of yellow fever. Yellow fever is a viral disease that has plagued mostly port cities over the last several centuries. It involves fever, headache, muscle pain, nausea, and in severe cases, it involves internal bleeding and black vomit, vomito negro in Spanish, which is the Spanish term for yellow fever. Usually there's a lag of 10 to 15 days after a ship docked until the first local case arose. And we'll see the reason for that in just a few minutes. In 1900, the United States government sent to Havana the Yellow Fever Board to work with Dr. Carlos Finley to find the cause of yellow fever. The Yellow Fever Board consisted of Major Walter Reed, Dr. James Carroll, Dr. Aristides Agramante, and Dr. Jesse Lazear. Carlos Finley was one of the early proponents for the mosquito theory of the transmission for yellow fever. It wasn't Finley who first thought of the idea that mosquitoes might carry yellow fever, but he was one of the real early proponents of it. And here's a quote from Finley in the late 1870s. "It occurred to me that to inoculate yellow fever, it would be necessary to pick out the inoculable material from within the blood vessels of a yellow fever patient and to carry it likewise into the interior of a blood vessel of a person who was to be inoculated, all of which conditions the mosquito satisfied most admirably through its bite." Major Walter Reed also believed in the mosquito theory, and he believed that Dr. Finley was right. And after the experiments were finished, he wrote in 1901 that previous investigators were simply accepting the statements of others who had nothing on which to base such statements. A little careful testing of this Fomite theory has served to knock it to smithereens. I thank God that I did not accept anybody's opinion on this subject, but determined to put it to a thorough test with human beings in order to see what happened. So Reed realized that he had to experiment on human beings in order to really see what causes yellow fever. The Fomite theory was the competing theory for the transmission of yellow fever. Fomites were thought to be organisms that were present in the bedding or clothing of infected patients, and that these fomites would cause yellow fever. So Reed didn't believe in this theory, so he wanted to show, one, that the Fomite theory was incorrect, and two, that the mosquito theory was correct. So in the summer of 1900, they began experiments on humans. One of the members of the Yellow Fever Board, Dr. James Carroll, was bitten by a loaded mosquito in Havana. They were breeding mosquitoes, and they would have mosquitoes bite a yellow fever patient, which they called loading the mosquito. And Dr. Carroll eventually contracted yellow fever, but he survived. In August of 1900, Private William Dean was bitten by a loaded mosquito at Columbia Barracks, which was outside of Havana, and Private Dean contracted yellow fever and survived. In September of 1900, Dr. Jesse Lazear was bitten by a loaded mosquito in Havana, and Dr. Lazear contracted yellow fever and died from it. And the difference between one of these and the other two is that William Dean contracted yellow fever at Columbia Barracks. This was well away from Havana, and it was a region where yellow fever was unknown. No one in the region had contracted yellow fever, but Havana was a place where yellow fever had thrived. So Reed realized that Carroll's and Lazear's cases were not necessarily caused by the bite of a loaded mosquito. It could have been that they contracted yellow fever just by being in Havana. So this caused Dr. Reed to rethink the experiments that they were running. Now, Lazear was also bitten by a loaded mosquito, and in his notebook entry, he says, "This guinea pig," probably referring to himself, "bitten today by a mosquito which developed from an egg laid by a mosquito which bit Tanner and Suarez on previous days." This experiment was done in Havana, and Major Walter Reed wrote this after he discovered that Lazear was infected in Havana, but before he knew that Lazear had died. And Reed said, "If you," referring to Lazear, "my dear doctor, had, prior to your bite, remained at Camp Columbia for 10 days, then we would have had a clear case, but you didn't. You went just where you might have contracted the disease from another case. Unfortunately, Lazear was bitten at Las Animas Hospital. That knocks his case out. I mean, as a thoroughly scientific experiment." So the fact that Lazear and Carroll acquired yellow fever in Havana made their cases not very scientific, because they could have caught it from some other source. So one experiment, experiment one, that the Yellow Fever Board designed was to make a controlled experiment where some volunteers were assigned to an infected clothing and bedding room, and the other arm, the volunteers were given a bite from a loaded mosquito. So in the infected clothing and bedding group, they had built a small building and furnished it with clothing and bedding from yellow fever patients. And then some volunteers spent 20 nights in such a room. And the results of the experiment were rather disappointing to Dr. Reed. None of the 3 subjects in the infected clothing and bedding side developed yellow fever, but also none of those who received a bite from a loaded mosquito developed yellow fever. And this is probably due to the extrinsic incubation period, which means it takes 10 to 15 days for a mosquito to bite an infected patient and then pass it on to another patient. They were just discovering this extrinsic incubation period during this time, and that probably explains why none of the 4 in the loaded mosquito group developed yellow fever. In a follow-up, they gave a loaded mosquito bite to 4 additional patients, and all 4 developed yellow fever. Experiment 2 involved 2 arms again, and they built a small building, mosquito netting in the middle. One side they filled with loaded mosquitoes, and the other side was a control group. And the mosquito group and the control group were in the same region. This was Camp Lazear. This is a region outside of Havana where there had been no yellow fever. And so in this experiment, none of the 2 subjects in the control group developed yellow fever, and one of the 2 in the mosquito bite developed yellow fever. The important thing about all of these experiments is they were done in a region outside of Havana where no one had ever gotten yellow fever. Another important aspect was that there was a control group for each of these. So this accumulated a fair amount of evidence for the mosquito theory. The experiments were done in a region free of yellow fever. There were control groups in each. Private William Dean was probably the first patient ever to receive a bite from a loaded mosquito in a region where yellow fever was not occurring. The follow-up data to experiment 1 also showed that several patients would develop yellow fever from a loaded mosquito bite, and experiment 2 provided additional information for that. Since 1900, when these experiments were run, there have been methods for yellow fever mitigation. For example, the elimination of the species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti, by spraying, avoiding standing water. In the 1930s, a vaccine was developed by Max Zeiler, who won the Nobel Prize in 1951 for this work. And people could attempt to avoid mosquito bites by netting, protective clothing, insect repellent, and so on. And since then, there's been no death in the United States from yellow fever since 1905, and the last death in Panama occurred in 1906. There is still yellow fever in some parts of the world, mostly South America and Africa. But the knowledge of how it spread allowed public health workers to mitigate the effect of yellow fever by these measures.